Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please send the like button a really nice gift basket for their birthday. But don't tell them you've doused it entirely in anthrax. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of February 20th, 1881, a police officer led a search party through the woods in Hill County, Texas, which at the time was a very rural farming community with lots of dense, undeveloped woodland. The officer and the search party were looking for a father of 7 named George Arnold, who had vanished from his home 2 days earlier. The day that George had gone missing was a Sunday, and he, his wife, and their kids always went to church together on Sundays. But on that morning, George had told his family, for reasons unknown, that he actually wanted to stay home, which was very out of character for him. Nonetheless, his wife and kids had gone to church without him, and then when they had returned, George was gone. Now, there was no sign of a struggle or any issues at the house. The only clue as to where George may have gone was a letter he left behind for his wife. And in this letter, he said he had gone off into the woods and that she should not follow him. And so again, that was 2 days ago. And so now the police officer and the search party were searching the forest near the home where George lived. The lead officer is trudging through the woods. They're way off the beaten path at this point. They eventually came to this pretty decent sized clearing. And in the middle of the clearing is this one huge tree. And at the base of the tree was George. So at this point, you need to understand that there was some nuance to the letter that George left behind for his wife. He didn't just say, "I'm going into the woods, don't follow me." He said, "I have to go into the woods." And the way the letter ended was George saying how much he loved his family and wished he didn't have to do this, but he'd given it some thought and it had to be done. Back in the woods, the Maine police officer and the search party, they see George at the base of this tree and they hustle over to him. But even before they were right on top of him, it was obvious he was dead. However, that wasn't the main sentiment as they're walking over, that, oh my gosh, George is dead. Instead, it was like, what happened here? George was chained by his ankle to the tree he was sitting next to. There was a padlock on the chain. There was no way to get it off. George was also completely naked, but his clothes were sort of tattered up and sitting in a pile right next to him. And George was covered in all these scrapes and cuts, and they looked like teeth marks, but not teeth marks from animals, teeth marks from a human's mouth. And then next to him on the ground, along with his clothes, were all these little like white stones. But when the officers walked over and looked more closely, they realized the white stones were actually teeth, George's teeth. And the tree that he was lying up against had all these deep gouges in it that sort of looked like if you took your own teeth and began biting into the wood to the point where you were breaking your teeth off, which is apparently what George was doing. And then also scattered amongst his teeth were many of George's fingernails, because apparently George had also been raking his fingernails against this tree until he tore out his nails. And so the officers and the search party are looking at this thinking, why would he do this? This all basically looks self-inflicted. What's going on? Well, it would turn out, quite recently, something very bad happened to George. He was bit by a dog who was carrying rabies. Now, today, if you're bit by an animal that has rabies, you just get a rabies shot. You're good. It's totally curable. But in 1881, the cure didn't exist. And so if you got rabies, it was a 100% death sentence. And so very likely, shortly after getting bit by this dog, George would have begun to have early symptoms of rabies. He would have begun to feel sick and been very irritable. And also, he would have very likely begun to have some hallucinations. And for George, he apparently understood what this all meant. He had rabies, and he knew what was coming next. And he didn't want to put his family in harm's way. Now, George was a very religious guy, so he didn't believe in the idea of taking your own life. And so instead, what he did is he wrote this letter to his wife that sort of broadly explained that I have to do this and I'm so sorry. And then he went into the woods, chained himself there, and basically allowed himself to die this horrible death, where he must have been in so much agony and pain that he's doing things like biting the tree until his teeth broke off and his nails fell off. His death must have been absolutely wretched and painful, but he did it to protect his family. There is one person in history whose name is so tied to horror that in many ways it's become sort of synonymous with evil. This person committed some of the world's worst atrocities. And in fact, they could have committed many more that we don't even know about. And part of the reason we don't know about it is because they got away with it. And even worse, they never came out and said why they did anything. There's no motive, there's no manifesto, there's virtually no communication with authorities or the public or anything. However, there is one time that this killer, for whatever reason, did reach out and communicate with somebody. And this interaction is simply known as from hell. On the evening of October 12th, 1888, a 49-year-old businessman named George Lusk walked into his upscale home in East London. He grabbed the mail that his housekeeper had set out on the table by the door, and he began sifting through it. And at first, all he saw were a couple letters from friends, and he saw a couple of invitations to upcoming parties. And then he got to the bottom of the mail pile, and he stopped. Because at the bottom of the mail pile, there was a postcard and a letter. Over the past 2 months, 4 people had been killed in George's neighborhood. And in fact, the most recent victim was a middle-aged woman who had been killed about 2 weeks ago, really not far from George's home. And on this mail, on these 2 pieces of mail, the return address was the name of this uncaught serial killer. George was so scared of this killer, as he should be, that he had formed this neighborhood watch group to go out and try to catch this killer. And in fact, just recently, when George was just looking out his front window onto the road, just kind of looking around, not part of his neighborhood watch group, but just kind of scanning the area, he had seen this kind of sketchy-looking guy with a big, thick beard standing on the other side of the road, and he was kind of in this alleyway. And this guy, it looked like he was staring right at George, very intently so. And George at first returned the stare, but then felt so uncomfortable that he drew the blinds and kind of hid from his window. Because again, he's thinking, there is a killer on the loose, maybe that's him. George actually had been so scared at seeing this guy that he had actually gone to the police and filed a report and said, I don't know, I think that guy could have been the killer. But the police really couldn't do anything because all they had was a sort of generic description of some guy standing on the road not doing anything. So nothing was ever done. And so George, even though he was scared, he opened up these letters, and it was even more alarming than he could have thought. Because whoever wrote this, whether it was the killer or not, they were basically taunting George, saying, yeah, I know you stood up the neighborhood watch group. I don't care. I can do whatever I want. I can kill with impunity. In fact, I'm going to kill 2 people tomorrow night, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. George just gathered up the letter and the postcard. He left his house right away and literally ran to the police station. And when he got there, he showed them the letters and said, look, this is from the killer. It feels authentic. He's going to kill 2 people tomorrow night. You got to do something. And so the police, they took the letters and they read them and they agreed that they did seem, authentic. But at the same time, they're like, there's really no way to tell if these are real. I mean, this could easily be a hoax. And even if this was real, what do we do? Who are the 2 people the killer's going to go after? How can we possibly protect them? George was told to go home and, just play it safe, stay home, stay inside, and let the police do their job. Over the next couple of days, George was basically sitting on pins and needles waiting to find out that, sure enough, a double homicide was committed somewhere in the neighborhood. But there was no news of any homicides. Things were calm. There was no news of the killer anywhere. And so George told himself that, he was overreacting. Clearly those letters he got must have been hoaxes. But then on October 16th, so 4 days after George received those 2 pieces of mail from the killer, He came home and he went inside, and like normal, his housekeeper had set the mail on the table right inside the house. In addition to all the paper mail, stacked on top of it was this little package, and it was wrapped in brown paper. He picks up the box, and very apprehensively, he begins to unwrap it. Once it opens up, he sees there's a letter sitting on top of this box. And the letter at the top, it says, "From hell." That middle-aged woman who had been murdered just a couple of weeks earlier right near George's house, well, when she was found, one, they identified that she clearly had been killed by the same serial killer that was still uncaught. But two, she was missing something, her kidney. The package that George received inside of that box itself included half of a kidney. And then the body of the letter explained that this was the other half of that woman's kidney because the killer had eaten the other half. And this half was a gift for George. The letters and the box containing that half of a kidney are considered to be potentially the only authentic communications from Jack the Ripper. Around 7 p.m. on May 21st, 1985, a 17-year-old boy named Jason Finley sat on the edge of his bed in his grandmother's spare bedroom in the suburb of Scotch Plains, New Jersey. He took a deep breath and then grabbed the landline phone next to the bed and then punched in the number of the girl he had been seeing for the past couple of weeks. Jason really liked this girl. Her name was Kathy, and tonight he wanted to finally ask her to officially be his girlfriend. As the phone rang, Jason found himself staring out the window at the raging thunderstorm that was going on outside. In fact, it had been raining so hard that day that Jason and his twin cousins and his grandmother had all basically had to stay inside the whole day. Jason had actually admitted to them earlier in the week that he really wanted to call this girl, Kathy, and ask her to be his girlfriend, but he didn't have the nerve to do it. And they had immediately begun ridiculing him, so now stepping away to make this phone call was kind of like the first moment of peace for Jason. Jason heard Kathy pick up the phone. And when he heard her sweet voice, it was like all his thoughts of his annoying cousins disappeared from his mind, and suddenly Jason was overwhelmed with this urge to just blurt out, "Will you be my girlfriend?" He took a breath like he was about to tell her, about to finally ask her this question. But right before the words escaped his mouth, he felt this unbelievably shooting pain in the back of his head, and then everything went black. At the same time this was happening, down the hallway in the kitchen, Jason's grandmother had just finished making dinner, and so she called out for Jason and the cousins to come set the table. The twins came into the kitchen, but a few moments went by and Jason hadn't shown up yet. So Jason's grandmother told the twins to, go down there and see what he's doing and get him in here for dinner. They walked down the hall, they went into the room where Jason was, and then a moment later, Jason's grandmother heard screams. She rushed down the hallway, she goes into the bedroom, and she finds the twins standing over Jason, and Jason is slumped over in bed, and the phone receiver is up against his ear, but he's not moving. It sort of looked like he was asleep, but when they would shake him and yell to him, he was totally unresponsive. She picked up the phone and she dialed 911. Not long after, an ambulance arrived at the house and EMTs rushed in. They grabbed Jason, they put him on a stretcher, and they rushed him into the ambulance and back to the hospital. But when they got there, Jason was declared dead. Jason was 17 years old and completely healthy. And doctors, when they received him, they would say that there did not appear to be anything wrong with him. Nothing medically anyways. And so basically, Jason's heartbroken family was told, "We don't know what happened. He just died." But Jason's family could not accept that. The family pushed for a much more thorough forensic investigation into his death. And that's when things got weird. And at first, the autopsy showed basically what the doctors at the hospital first thought, which is there isn't a clear reason for why he died. And although it's very tough to accept that, it is the case that people do sometimes just die, even perfectly healthy people. However, the forensic investigator that was doing this very thorough autopsy did discover one thing that the hospital didn't find. And that was that Jason had a ruptured eardrum. Now, generally speaking, this would not have been a big, "wow, we figured it out" moment. However, the forensic investigator was trying to come up with all these different theories about what could have killed Jason. And when they found the ruptured eardrum, paired with something else they had sort of zeroed in on, which was the weather at the time of Jason's death, they put those things together and realized they had figured it out. It would turn out, when Jason was on the phone speaking to Kathy, lightning struck the phone line outside. The electricity carried through the line, through the phone, into Jason's head, killed him instantly. As for Kathy, she would later say that she could tell Jason was almost certainly going to ask her to be his girlfriend. And she said, had he asked, she would have said yes. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.